Imagine a medieval banquet hall, rich with the gleam of polished silver and the scent of exotic spices hanging thick in the air. Torches flicker, illuminating tables groaning under the weight of sumptuous dishes, each more elaborate and astonishing than the last. Among these spectacles, one dish stands out not just for its taste, but for its sheer audacity and the story. It tells about power, spectacle, and the strange appetites of the elite. This is the story of the cockatrice, a grotesque, fascinating culinary marvel where two birds were sewn together, one inside the other and baked inside a pie, then served whole with feathers painstakingly reattached. A dish designed to dazzle, disturb, and demonstrate the unimaginable wealth and power of medieval nobility. To truly appreciate the cockatrice, you must understand the culture and mindset of the medieval elite. Banquets were more than meals, they were grand theatrical performances. Every dish was a statement, every ingredient a symbol. These feasts were displays of status and mastery, opportunities to flaunt wealth, to intimidate rivals, and to reinforce social hierarchy. The more elaborate the spectacle, the higher the prestige, and the cockatrice with its surreal anatomy and intricate preparation was the pinnacle of such culinary theatre. The term cockatrice is derived from cock rooster and tyrus, or turkey. Though the exact etymology is debated, what's indisputable is the dish's bizarre construction. A small bird, often a suckling piglet or young capon, was sewn inside a larger bird, such as a capon or turkey. Sometimes the head and front half of a rooster would be grafted onto the body of a capon or goose, creating a chimera-like creature, half rooster, half other bird, with an unnatural, unsettling appearance. This stitched-together beast was then plucked to bare skin, carefully basted, and roasted. After cooking, feathers were painstakingly reattached, restoring the illusion of a living bird. The finished product was so lifelike and fantastical that it both fascinated and horrified guests. Why go to such lengths? This was no mere culinary curiosity. It was a deliberate symbol of the power to manipulate nature itself. Medieval nobles sought to demonstrate dominion not only over lands and people, but over the very food that sustained them. The cockatrice embodied this mastery, a living paradox sewn into one grotesque form, a challenge to natural order. Serving this dish at a banquet was a declaration. Here are people who command resources and talents to bend reality for their amusement. Historical records from the 14th and 15th centuries describe these extravagant dishes as part of grand feasts, held by monarchs and high-ranking nobles. Chronicles mention elaborate preparations stretching over days, involving teams of skilled cooks and artists who collaborated to produce these edible spectacles. The cockatrice was often the centerpiece, arriving on a grand platter to gasps and nervous laughter. Sometimes, the dish was enclosed within a pie crust, which was then sliced open in front of guests, revealing the bizarre creature inside. A moment of shock, awe, and delight. But the cockatrice was more than just shock value. It reflected the medieval worldview steeped in symbolism, allegory, and layered meaning. Birds themselves were potent symbols, the rooster representing vigilance and bravery, the capon signifying wealth and indulgence. Combining them created a chimera that might evoke ideas of hybrid power, control over chaos, or even mystical forces. It is possible that such dishes were intended to remind guests of the complexity and fragility of the social order, balanced precariously like the sand-together creatures on their plates. Moreover, the preparation of the cockatrice showcased advanced culinary skills. The seamstress-like stitching of living creatures required not only anatomical knowledge, but also artistry and patience. The cooks had to ensure that the combined birds could be cooked evenly without falling apart, while preserving an impressive visual appearance. The act of reattaching feathers after roasting further reveals the lengths taken to amaze the senses. Beyond mere taste, the tactile and visual elements were just as important. Feasting was deeply political in medieval courts. Invitations to such banquets were marks of favor and influence. Guests were expected to respond appropriately to the grandeur, demonstrating their own knowledge, manners, and capacity for awe. The cockentrist, with its surreal presentation, forced an emotional response, astonishment mingled with discomfort. It unsettled expectations and challenged guests to reconcile their appreciation for luxury with a primal unease at the unnatural. Such extravagant dishes also hinted at the darker realities of medieval life. Outside these great halls, famine, disease, and poverty were rampant. The spectacle of sewing birds inside birds to create edible monsters was a stark contrast to the daily struggles of the masses. In this light, the cockentrice serves as a reminder of how food functioned as a political tool and a marker of social divider. Feast for the few that reinforced exclusion and power. Over time, the cockentrice faded from favor, as tastes and social attitudes evolved. The rise of new culinary styles and changing notions of decorum rendered such grotesqueries less desirable, yet the memory of this bizarre dish lingers, offering a window into a world where food was not just sustenance, but spectacle, theater, and a symbol of dominion over nature and society. Today, historians and culinary enthusiasts look back at the cockentrice as a symbol of medieval extravagance and the complex interplay of power, art, and food culture. It forces us to reflect on how humans use food to express identity, status, and even control, sometimes crossing the boundaries of the natural world to do so. In the end, the cockentrice remains an unforgettable emblem of a time when nobles feasted on fantasies sewn from flesh and feathers, creating edible myths that astonished and disturbed, reminding all who beheld them that power could twist nature itself into a spectacle of dominance and delight. The desert that used live blackbirds, sealed into the crust, imagine a grand medieval banquet. The great hall of a castle, alive with flickering torchlight. Noble guests clad in velvet and silk, awaiting the next marvel to grace their tables. Among the many dishes brought forth, one stands apart: a large, golden pie, sealed tight. But this was no ordinary pastry. Within its crust were live blackbirds, trapped in a way that, when cut open, they would burst free, flapping wildly in startled flight. This was the live bird pie, a spectacle of culinary theater that both amazed and unsettled medieval nobles. This practice was not mere whimsy. It was an intentional, symbolic display woven into the very fabric of medieval feasting culture. To understand it, we must first grasp that medieval banquets were performances as much as meals. They were opportunities for nobility to demonstrate wealth, power, and refinement. Food was a stage for symbolism, surprise, and status. The live bird pie embodied all this, a breathtaking mixture of artistry, cruelty, and spectacle. Birds, often blackbirds for their size and common availability, were carefully enclosed within a hollow crust, sometimes called a coffin. This crust was baked to golden perfection, sturdy enough to contain the frightened birds safely from oven heat. When the pie was cut, the sudden release of live birds startled the guests, filling the hall with the frantic beating of wings and sharp cries. The effect was dazzling, both an act of wonder and a reminder of life's unpredictability. But why seal live birds inside a pie? This practice reflected medieval beliefs about nature, fortune, and control. Blackbirds carried symbolism. In folklore, romance, magic, and mystery. Releasing them in this dramatic fashion was thought to bring luck or signal divine favor. More than that, it was a demonstration of human mastery over nature, capturing wild creatures, confining them within a crafted shell, then unleashing them on command. It was a vivid metaphor for power, unpredictability, and social order. The preparation demanded extraordinary skill. Bakers had to build the crust thick and insulated enough to protect the birds from lethal heat, often creating a separate enclosure within the pie. The birds were sometimes placed alive moments before, serving to ensure survival. This intricate craftsmanship elevated the dish beyond food into a theatrical art form, integral to the spectacle of the feast. Medieval society viewed animals differently than we do today. While modern sensibilities recoil at such cruelty, in the medieval worldview, animals were part of a cosmic order to be used, controlled, and symbolically manipulated. The bird's panic and flight were not merely entertainment. They were a vivid enactment of themes central to medieval life: captivity and freedom, chaos and order, fate and fortune. Historical records and cookbooks from the period hint at this practice, and some illuminated manuscripts depict extravagant pies bursting with birds or other surprises. This theatrical dining mirrored the culture's fascination with the mysterious and supernatural, where even food could channel spiritual or magical forces. Yet, the spectacle also had a practical social function. It disrupted the formal, ritualized atmosphere of noble dining, injecting unpredictability and excitement. The sudden flight of birds was a shared moment of astonishment, laughter, and breaking social tension and reinforcing bonds among the elite. Over time, evolving tastes and ethical considerations led to the decline of the live bird pie. Changing culinary fashions and increased sensitivity toward animals made such dishes obsolete. However, echoes remain in modern culinary theater surprise elements designed to provoke wonder and engagement. The live bird pie stands as a vivid window into a past world where food was not just nourishment but a language of power and magic. A performance embodying the complex relationship between humans and nature. It challenges us to understand medieval culture on its own terms, where cruelty and creativity, control and chaos, spectacle and sustenance intertwined. As you picture that great whole, the crust slicing open, and startled birds bursting forth, consider the layers of meaning beneath. A society's worldview baked into a pie. A fleeting moment capturing life's wild unpredictability within human hands. The live bird pie was not simply food. It was a living symbol of medieval life's drama, mystery, and power. The bread so poisonous it caused hallucinations and dancing plagues. Imagine a world where the very staple of life, bread, turns from nourishment into a source of terror, where each slice hides a poisonous secret that twists minds and bodies into frenzied chaos. This is not fantasy or myth. This dark chapter of history unfolded across Europe during the late Middle Ages and early modern era, where desperate peasants, starving in famine, consumed rye bread contaminated by a deadly fungus. The result: hallucinations, seizures, and strange outbreaks of mass hysteria so intense they birthed terrifying events known as dancing plagues. Entire villages would find themselves seized by uncontrollable convulsions and bizarre, trance-like dances that sometimes lasted days, even weeks, leaving death and bewilderment in their wake. This is the story of ergotism. The bread so poisonous it caused visions, madness, and convulsive epidemics that the people of the time interpreted as divine possession or curses from above. At the heart of this phenomenon was a microscopic invader, the ergot fungus, scientifically called Claviceps purpurea. This parasitic fungus infects rye and other cereal grains, replacing healthy kernels with dark, hardened masses called These sclerotia are packed with toxic alkaloids compounds like ergotamine and other lysergic acid derivatives that can wreak havoc on the human nervous system. Ingesting even small amounts of these toxins could trigger severe vasoconstriction, cutting off blood flow to limbs, leading to agonizing pain, gangrene, and even limb loss. But it also affects the brain, causing terrifying symptoms such as convulsions, hallucinations, delirium, and in some cases, psychosis. The peasants who baked rye bread during times of scarcity often could not distinguish between healthy grains, and those infected with ergot. Desperation forced them to consume whatever they could gather, unknowingly baking ergot into their daily loaves. Unlike today, medieval societies lacked the scientific knowledge to identify or understand this fungal menace. Instead, the terrifying physical and psychological symptoms were interpreted through the lens of superstition, religion, and folklore. One of the most infamous episodes linked to ergot poisoning was the Dancing Plague of 1518, which took place in Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire. It began in July when a woman, Frau Trophia, suddenly started dancing wildly in the streets. Her movements were frenzied and unrelenting. Within days, dozens more joined her, men, women, even children, caught in the same uncontrollable Compulsion to dance? Some historians estimate that as many as 400 people danced for weeks without rest. Exhaustion, heart attacks, and strokes claimed many lives. The local authorities were baffled. They sought explanations in supernatural causes, curses, divine punishment, or possession by evil spirits. Medieval physicians, priests, and magistrates were powerless to halt the strange epidemic. Some recommended that the afflicted keep dancing to sweat out the evil. Consequently, guildhalls and chapels hired musicians to accompany the dancers, hoping to provide relief. But the more they danced, the worse it seemed to become. The afflicted appeared entranced, unable to stop, trapped in a tragic dance with death itself. Modern science suggests that ergot poisoning, combined with social and psychological stresses like famine, disease, and religious fervor, catalyzed these outbreaks of mass hysteria. The toxic ergot alkaloids could induce seizures and hallucinations, creating sensations of burning limbs and visions of terrifying apparitions. Under such influence, the afflicted might genuinely believe they were possessed or called to dance by divine forces. The communal nature of these events, neighbors seeing others dance uncontrollably, likely triggered a contagious psychological phenomenon. Amplifying the crisis, ergotism was not isolated to the dancing plagues. Across medieval Europe, outbreaks of what was then called St. Anthony's fire-ravaged villages, named after the patron saint of those suffering from the affliction. These epidemics caused burning pain, convulsions, and gangrene. Sufferers endured agonies that modern medicine now attributes to ergot poisoning. Because the disease mimicked signs of divine wrath or witchcraft, sufferers were often shunned or persecuted. The socio-economic context is crucial. Ergot thrives in damp, cool climates, particularly infecting rye hardy grain that poor peasants relied on when wheat failed or was unaffordable. During times of famine, when grain selection was less rigorous and food shortages desperate, the risk of ergot contamination soared. The desperation to survive forced people to consume contaminated bread, sealing their fate. The medieval world was ill-equipped to deal with such poisonings. The lack of understanding of microscopic organisms, no knowledge of fungal infections, and a worldview dominated by religion and superstition meant the real cause remained a mystery for centuries. Only in the 17th and 18th centuries did scholars begin to unravel the link between ergot fungus and ergotism. Fast forward to today. Ergot alkaloids have been studied extensively and even used medicinally in controlled doses, notably in treating migraines and inducing labor. Moreover, the hallucinogenic compound LSD was first synthesized based on ergot alkaloids. But the dark history remains a chilling reminder of how nature's smallest organisms can unleash devastation. In retrospect, the dancing plagues and ergotism outbreaks reveal much about the fragile boundary between physical health, mental well-being, and societal belief systems. They expose how, in the face of inexplicable suffering, humans seek meaning, often turning to religion, magic, or the supernatural to explain horrors science had yet to understand. The poisoned bread that fed the starving peasants was both a literal and metaphorical nightmare, nourishment transformed into a venomous agent of madness and death. The desperate dances, the visions, the agonies endured all reflect the tragic human cost of famine and ignorance. They remind us that behind every strange historical event lies a complex interplay of biology, environment, culture, and psychology. As you walk past a simple loaf of bread today, remember the centuries-old story embedded within its grains, of a fungus so powerful it could twist minds, seize bodies, and turn entire communities into theaters of delirium and despair. A story of survival, fear, and the haunting dance between humanity and nature's invisible poisons. The soup thickened with crushed bricks and animal blood in the medieval world, where famine and scarcity were constant threats. Food was never simply about sustenance, it was an art, a medicine, and often a desperate act of survival. Among the most unusual culinary practices that echo through history is the use of powdered crushed bricks and animal blood to thicken soups and stews. To the modern mind, this sounds grotesque, but in its own time, this strange mixture was a complex symbol of resilience and strength, deeply woven into the medieval understanding of nutrition and healing. Medieval cooks, especially those tending to the poor or preparing medicinal broths, faced immense challenges. Fresh ingredients were not always available, and the hunger of the common folk demanded creative solutions to provide something filling, nourishing, and sustaining. They turned to ingredients that seem foreign, even repulsive today, yet were believed to restore the body's inner balance and vigor. The practice of adding powdered bricks to food might strike us as madness or desperation, but in medieval, medical, and alchemical traditions, it was closely linked to the idea of rebuilding the body's internal fabric. Bricks, made primarily from fired clay and earth, contained minerals thought to strengthen bones and tissues when ingested. This belief was partly symbolic, earth representing solidity and endurance, but it was also pragmatic. Given the limited medical knowledge of the time, crushing bricks into fine powder allowed this mineral-rich substance to be mixed into soups, thickening them and giving the broth a distinctive reddish or brownish hue. This was not done merely for aesthetics, but to mimic the appearance of richness and heartiness, especially in times when actual meat or fat was scarce or prohibitively expensive. The resulting soup looked as though it had been enriched with blood or thickened with cream, even if it contained neither. Blood itself was a crucial ingredient in medieval cookery and medicine. Animal blood, often from pigs or cattle, was used widely in recipes, not only to enhance flavor, but because it was believed to carry vital life force. Blood was rich in iron and proteins, and its incorporation into dishes symbolized vitality and strength. It was not unusual for soups and pottages to be thickened or enriched with fresh or dried blood, sometimes mixed with other thickeners, like crushed bones or flour. In some regions, the blood was allowed to coagulate before being mixed into the broth, adding texture and a unique flavor profile that was prized by certain social groups. This was particularly true in Northern and Eastern Europe, where blood, sausages, and blood-enriched dishes have long-standing traditions. Blood soups were often considered restorative, especially for those recovering from illness or childbirth, reflecting a belief that consuming blood could replenish lost vitality. The union of powdered brick and animal blood in soup was therefore a multi-layered practice, part culinary improvisation, part folk medicine, and part symbolic alchemy. Medieval society was deeply influenced by humoral theory, which posited that health depended on balancing bodily fluids, or humors. Foods that were believed to be warm, moist, or nourishing were prescribed to counteract imbalances caused by cold or dryness. The addition of blood and mineral substances to food was thought to restore warmth and energy to a weakened body. Moreover, the texture and appearance of these fortified soups served a psychological function. To eat a thick, richly colored broth gave the impression of strength and sustenance, providing comfort in times of hardship. It reinforced the idea that even when meat was scarce, the body could be nourished by earth and animal essence combined, linking the eater to the fundamental elements of life itself, blood and fire. Historical records and medieval cookbooks reveal occasional mentions of such practices. While not widespread among the wealthy, who had access to fresh meats and spices, these thickened blood and mineral soups were more common among peasants and in monastic infirmaries. They reflect a culinary pragmatism shaped by scarcity, but also a sophisticated cultural understanding of food as medicine. Archaeological evidence supports this notion. Analyzers of residue in medieval cooking vessels sometimes detect traces of iron-rich compounds, possibly from animal blood, alongside mineral deposits consistent with crushed ceramics or bricks. These findings confirm that what sounds like superstition was often an adaptive practice born of necessity and medieval dietary theory. This practice also highlights the blurred boundaries between cooking, healing, and ritual in the Middle Ages. Food was rarely neutral. It was embedded with spiritual and symbolic meaning. Blood was sacred and potent. Earth was the origin of life. And fire, the element used to bake bricks, represented transformation. To consume a soup thickened with crushed bricks and blood was, in a sense, to partake in a ritual of renewal and survival. In modern times, such recipes might inspire revulsion or disbelief. Yet understanding this practice through the lens of its era reveals a story of human ingenuity, resilience, and the deep desire to find strength even in the harshest conditions. It speaks to a world where nutrition and medicine were inseparable, where every meal was a potential act of healing, and where survival depended on turning the very earth beneath one's feet into a source of life. So next time you imagine a medieval kitchen, picture not only the fragrant herbs and roasted meats, but also the thick, earthy broths, quietly simmering with crushed bricks and darkened by animal blood. These were not just meals, they were lifelines, shaped by belief, hardship, and the unyielding will to endure. The cheese that had to crawl off the table to be considered ripe in the shadowy corners of medieval and early modern Europe, where food preservation was as much an art as a necessity. There thrived a peculiar culinary tradition, one that would horrify many modern palates, yet was deeply cherished by connoisseurs of the time. This tradition was the production and consumption of cheese so profoundly alive that it seemed to possess its own will. Cheeses that were left to rot until maggots hatched and wriggled inside them, transforming the very essence of the dairy into a living delicacy. The most infamous of these was the Sardinian cheese known as casu-marzu, sometimes translated as rotten cheese, or, more chillingly, maggot cheese. Casu-marzu was not just a product of neglect or decay. It was a deliberately cultivated experience of fermentation taken to its extreme. Originating from Sardinia, this cheese was made from sheep's milk and allowed to ferment until it reached a stage far beyond conventional ripeness. At this stage, cheese fly larvae, tiny white maggots, would be intentionally introduced or left to naturally infest the cheese, feeding on its fats and transforming its texture and flavor in ways that no traditional cheese aging process could replicate. The presence of these larvae was not a defect, but a prized feature. The writhing maggots inside the cheese were a sign of its peak maturation. In fact, the cheese was considered fully ripe only when these maggots could be seen crawling, even, famously, when they tried to escape the confines of the cheese itself, sometimes wriggling out onto the table. This active movement of maggots was viewed as a mark of freshness and vitality, proof that the cheese was alive in a way no other cheese could be. This living cheese had a taste described by those daring enough to eat it as intensely rich, creamy, and pungent, with a flavor so sharp and complex that it bordered on the sublime for aficionados. The maggots would break down the cheese's fats, rendering the texture unusually soft and spreadable, and imparting a piquant temps reminiscent of the strongest blue cheeses, but taken to a new, visceral level. Historical records and ethnographic studies reveal that casu-marzu was traditionally eaten with great reverence and care. It was typically spread on flatbread or consumed with strong red wines. The consumers often braved the unsettling sensation of maggots squirming inside the cheese and even in the mouth. Some would flick the wriggling larvae away before eating, while others swallowed them whole, believing the live maggots added to the cheese's health benefits. Though modern science raises concerns about potential health risks, such as intestinal myiasis, this tradition was not isolated. Similar practices occurred in other parts of Europe and the world, where cheeses or fermented foods were allowed to develop live cultures of insects or larvae as a form of fermentation enhancer. What distinguished casu-marzu, however, was the cultural acceptance, even celebration, of the maggot's movement as a sign of quality and freshness, a concept utterly alien to modern sensibilities about hygiene and food safety. The making of this cheese was a delicate balance. The cheesemaker had to time the aging process precisely to allow the cheese fly larvae to hatch and multiply, but not so long that the cheese decomposed into complete rot. If left unchecked, the cheese would degrade beyond edibility, becoming a putrid mass unfit even for those with the strongest stomachs. This balance between decay and fermentation exemplifies the medieval understanding of preservation as a dance, with natural processes rather than an attempt to halt time. Interestingly, casu-marzu was so culturally significant that it survived through centuries. even as industrialization and modern food safety laws sought to eliminate such hazardous practices. The cheese became illegal in the European Union due to health regulations, but underground production and consumption persist, highlighting the tension between tradition and modernity. To truly grasp the place of this maggot cheese in history, one must understand the broader medieval and early modern context in which food was intertwined with nature, superstition, and survival. In a time when refrigeration did not exist, and the risk of foodborne illness was constant, fermenting food with live organisms was not just a flavor choice, it was a strategy to prolong edibility, improve nutrition, and harness natural processes for sustenance. Moreover, the very concept of what was considered clean or unclean differed markedly from today. The visible presence of maggots was not a sign of neglect, but a token of life, an acceptance of decay as a form of transformation and renewal. The squirming larvae symbolized the continuum of life, feeding on death, a powerful metaphor woven into the cultural fabric of the region. In modern times, the story of Kasumazu forces us to confront our own sanitized views of food and nature. It challenges the boundaries between life and death, purity and corruption, disgust and delight. This cheese, crawling off the table in search of ripeness, embodies an ancient dialogue between humans and the microbial insect and fungal worlds, a dialogue that shaped culinary history in profound and unsettling ways. As you imagine the writhing larvae escaping their cheesy prison, remember that this was not mere grotesquerie, but a living tradition, an edible symbol of a different time's relationship with nature's cycles. It is a story of how the quest for flavor and sustenance led to practices that seem bizarre today, but were once celebrated as the pinnacle of gastronomic achievement. The cheese that had to crawl off the table to be considered ripe is a testament to humanity's enduring ingenuity and its complex, often uneasy, relationship with the natural world. It reminds us that taste is deeply cultural, and what one era or culture finds revolting, another may embrace as a delicacy that embodies life itself. The beer that had to be chewed before it could be brewed, long before modern brewing technologies and stainless steel vats. Before yeast packets and thermometer-controlled fermentations, there existed a ritual, both intimate and mysterious practice, that required human mouths to become the vessels of transformation. In remote corners of the world, particularly in indigenous and tribal societies, the creation of beer was not simply a matter of mixing grain and water. Instead, it began with the ritualistic act of women chewing barley, then spitting it into communal vats, setting in motion a biological process that would birth the ancient elixir we now know as beer. This practice, often called mouth beer brewing, reveals a fascinating intersection of biology, culture, and sacred labor. At first glance, the idea of chewing grain to brew beer may seem repulsive or primitive to modern sensibilities, but this method was deeply practical, ingenious, and loaded with meaning. It harnessed the power of saliva, specifically enzymes like amylase, which break down the complex starches in barley into simpler sugars, essential fuel for fermentation. Without this enzymatic action, fermentation simply could not begin. In places lacking advanced malting technology or warm climates suitable for natural starch breakdown, this human-assisted step was crucial. Anthropologists have documented this technique among various indigenous groups, from the Andes Mountains of South America to remote regions of Africa and Asia. In these communities, beer was more than a beverage, it was a social glue, a sacred offering, a shared labor binding generations and genders together. Women, in particular, were entrusted with this responsibility, turning, chewing, and spitting into a communal rite of creation. Each woman's saliva contributed its unique enzymatic signature, mingling to kickstart fermentation. The very act of brewing was an embodied ritual, part spiritual, part practical, that honored the cycle of life, transformation, and sustenance. Imagine the scene: a group of women gathered around large earthen vats, freshly harvested barley grains, softened by soaking. They took mouthfuls of the grain, chewing thoroughly to mash and mix it with saliva, then expectorated the mash back into the vat. This repeated process was slow, deliberate, and sacred. It was a physical and social act, an expression of trust and shared purpose. The vats, after being filled with this chewed mash, were left to ferment naturally, often sealed, and guarded carefully. As days passed, wild yeasts from the environment and sugars released by salivary enzymes combined to create the first bubbles of life alcohol. This method illustrates a profound understanding of fermentation long before modern microbiology. While today, we rely on isolated yeast cultures and controlled malting processes, these ancestral brewers harnessed nature and their own bodies to initiate a complex biochemical transformation. The enzymatic power of saliva was the key. Without it, the starch molecules in raw barley remain locked and inaccessible to yeast. Human saliva, rich in amylase, acted as a natural catalyst, breaking down starch into maltose and glucose, the very sugars that yeast feast upon to produce alcohol and carbonation. Yet, beyond the biochemical marvel, mouth beer brewing was layered with symbolism. The communal chewing was a literal infusion of human life into the beverage shared, essence binding drinkers to brewers and brewers to the land and grain. It was an act of intimacy, a blending of body and nature. This made the beer sacred, imbued with social and spiritual significance far beyond mere intoxication. In some cultures, this practice was connected with rites of passage, fertility ceremonies, and community celebrations. Today, traces of this ancient brewing method survive in a few remote locations, though largely replaced by modern techniques. Scientists and brewers fascinated by ancestral methods have sought to understand and even replicate the process, not only to preserve cultural heritage, but to explore the deep biological roots of fermentation. This echoes a broader truth. Human ingenuity has always found ways to work with nature's microscopic forces, using tools as simple as a mouthful of grain and the enzymes in our saliva. The story of mouth beer challenges us to reconsider our assumptions about technology, civilization, and the origins of our most cherished foods and drinks. It reveals brewing as a fundamentally human story, one that blends biology, culture, and ritual into a single remarkable act. It is a testament to how intimate, embodied knowledge shaped survival, celebration, and identity across millennia. Next time you raise a glass of beer, remember that its origins might trace back, not to machines or science labs, but to the humble act of chewing grain women's mouths, transforming starch into sugar, their spit fermenting into liquid gold, a sacred, shared labor that turned nature's bounty into life's celebration. The spices worth more than gold, but added to rotten meat in the lavish courts of medieval Europe, where the pursuit of luxury knew no bounds. An astonishing paradox unfolded on the plates of the nobility. Spices such as saffron, cloves, cinnamon, and pepperoides worth more than gold were used not only to tantalize taste buds, but often to conceal the most unsettling of truths, the foul stench of decaying meat. These prized spices, imported at great cost from distant lands, became the costly veil masking spoiled food, transforming it into what was celebrated as elite cuisine. The medieval world was a place of extreme contrasts. For the wealthy, feasting was a ritual of power, display, and indulgence. Exotic spices symbolized far-flung connections, immense wealth, and refined taste. Saffron, with its vibrant golden hue and bitter aromatic scent, was among the most coveted. Cloves, tiny flower buds packed with intense flavor and fragrance, commanded exorbitant prices. Such spices were traded along perilous routes, stretching from the east through Venice and the Mediterranean to the tables of kings and lords. Their value rivaled precious metals and gems, and their presence in a dish marked prestige. Yet, beneath this veneer of luxury lurked practical problems born of medieval preservation methods or the lack thereof. Refrigeration was centuries away, and food storage depended on salt curing, smoking, drying, or simply rapid consumption. Despite these methods, meat often spoiled in the damp, warm kitchens and cellars of the time. The passage from slaughterhouse to table was perilous and slow by modern standards. The result was that even noble kitchens struggled with rancid, off-putting meat. Here, spices stepped in, not merely as flavor enhancers, but as a strategic tool of culinary alchemy. Their powerful aromas and complex taste profiles could mask the unmistakable odors of rot and decay. A stew simmered with cloves, pepper, and saffron might disguise the sourness of old meat, turning it into a dish deemed acceptable or even desirable by courtly diners. This practice, while shocking to modern sensibilities, was an unspoken secret of medieval luxury dining. The use of expensive spices in this manner speaks volumes about medieval social dynamics and attitudes towards food. Nobles prized appearances and prestige above all else. The scent of fresh meat might not always be guaranteed, but the presence of costly spices was a visible and olfactory symbol of status and wealth. To serve a richly spiced dish was to signal power and refinement, regardless of the underlying quality of ingredients. Historical cookbooks, like the Form of Curie and La Viandia, abound with recipes laden with spices, often in quantities that would overpower any natural flavor of the meat itself. Recipes called for copious amounts of cinnamon, cloves, ginger, and nutmeg, not just for taste, but for their preservative and masking qualities. The bitterness of saffron could counteract sourness, while cloves offered a pungent aroma that overwhelmed unpleasant odors. Furthermore, medieval conceptions of taste and health were deeply intertwined with humoral theory. Spices were believed to balance bodily humors, warm the stomach, and aid digestion. Their pungency was seen as medicinal, capable of counteracting the cold or wet qualities of spoiled meat. Thus, the use of spices was justified, not only socially but also medically. The economic implications were profound. The spice trade was a lucrative business, fueling exploration, conquest, and intense competition among European powers. Spices were so precious that they were often used as currency or stored in treasure chests. Their consumption at feasts was a conspicuous display of wealth, far outweighing the importance of food freshness or quality. Spoiled meat, transformed by these liquid gold spices into acceptable fare, became a silent partner in the theater of aristocratic dining. The stark reality behind medieval feasts challenges our modern assumptions about historical cuisine. What we often imagine as lavish banquets filled with fresh, sumptuous dishes were sometimes built on decay hidden beneath a cloak of luxury. The powerful spices did more than flavor, they concealed. They allowed the elite to eat rotting meat without losing face, preserving not just physical health, but social standing. Yet, this was not mere deception, but part of a broader culinary culture that embraced complexity, contrast, and spectacle. Medieval food was as much about sensation and symbolism as nourishment. The interplay between rot and spice symbolized the delicate balance between life and death, purity and corruption, power and vulnerability. As preservation techniques improved and refrigeration emerged centuries later, the need to mask spoiled meat diminished, and culinary tastes shifted toward fresher ingredients and subtler flavors. But the legacy of medieval spice use endures, reminding us of a world where the quest for status could transform even the foulest of ingredients into symbols of grandeur. So, when we think of saffron and cloves as simple seasonings today, it is worth remembering their darker role in history. They were not just spices, they were alchemists of flavor and deception, turning rot into gold on the tables of kings. Behind the aroma of these precious powders lies a story of survival, power, and the complex art of medieval dining. The deadly salad believed to cure the soul and drain the body in the shadowed cloisters of medieval monasteries, where silence reigned and penance was the path to salvation. There existed a peculiar and deadly ritual, one that blended faith, medicine, and a perilous misunderstanding of nature's gifts. Monks, devoted to purging their souls of sin, consumed special penitential salads crafted from what were known as cold herbs. These were not the fresh greens of a garden, but potent, toxic plants like hemlock and foxglove herbs, believed to cleanse the soul by draining the body, often with fatal consequences. The idea of using food as a spiritual medicine is ancient, rooted in the belief that the physical and spiritual were inseparably entwined. In medieval Christian thought, sin was considered a corruption, not only of the soul, but also of the body. Purification required suffering and discipline. The ascetic lifestyle demanded abstinence, fasting, and sometimes the ingestion of substances thought to flush out spiritual impurity. Cold herbs, so named for their bitter, cooling qualities in the humoral medical system, were thought to be ideal for this sacred cleansing. Among the most infamous of these herbs was hemlock, a plant with a sinister reputation long before the Middle Ages. Hemlock contains coniine, or deadly neurotoxin that disrupts the nervous system, causing paralysis and respiratory failure. Its historical notoriety stretches back to the death of the Greek philosopher Socrates, who was sentenced to drink a hemlock concoction as execution. Yet, in medieval Europe, this knowledge was fragmented or misunderstood. Hemlock's bitter leaves were harvested and mixed with other cold herbs, included in salads served to monks and penitents to induce purification. Foxglove was another common ingredient, known scientifically as Digitalis purpurea. This plant contains powerful cardiac glycosides, while in modern medicine, Digitalis compounds are used carefully to treat heart conditions. Medieval consumers had no such knowledge of dosage or toxicity. Ingesting foxglove in uncontrolled amounts caused severe nausea, vomiting, dizziness, irregular heartbeats, and in many cases, death. The salad of penance was no casual meal, but a sacramental ordeal. Monks believed that by consuming these bitter leaves, they could weaken their bodies, suffering physical distress that mirrored the cleansing of their souls. The body's weakness was an outward sign of inner purification. This was a literal mortification of the flesher spiritual detox that demanded the willing acceptance of pain, even at the cost of health and life. These penitential salads were part of the broader medieval medical theory of humors, which held that health depended on the balance of bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness and sin were often seen as imbalances or corruptions of these humors. Bitter, cold herbs were prescribed to counteract excessive heat or moisture, aiming to restore balance. But when applied as punitive medicine for the soul, these herbs became weapons of self-imposed suffering. Historical records from monastic infirmaries and medieval herbals reveal that many monks succumbed to the toxic effects of these plants. Symptoms were recorded with a mixture of awe and helplessness, trembling limbs, blurred vision, convulsions, and sometimes fatal heart failure. Some chroniclers described these deaths as holy sacrifices, martyrdom through the pursuit of spiritual purity. One can imagine the quiet desperation behind these rituals. Monks, isolated from the world, seeking redemption through discipline, trusting in a system that blurred the lines between medicine and mysticism. The salads, bitter to the taste and deadly in effect, were a symbol of faith's, sometimes tragic, reach where the quest for salvation demanded the surrender of the very body that housed the soul. The paradox is haunting. Herbs that could cure ailments when used wisely became instruments of harm when wielded without understanding. Hemlock and foxglove, plants containing powerful bioactive compounds, straddled the line between medicine and poison. Without knowledge of safe doses, the line was easily crossed, and monks often paid with their lives. Beyond the monasteries, similar beliefs permeated medieval Europe's lay population. The idea that physical suffering could cleanse spiritual impurity was widespread, giving rise to various dangerous remedies and practices. But nowhere was this more ritualized or deadly than in the cloistered life of monks, whose very survival sometimes depended on consuming toxic cleansing salads. Modern toxicology and botany illuminate the dark realities behind these ancient practices. The cold herbs are now understood as plants containing alkaloids and glycosides with narrow therapeutic windows, meaning the difference between a cure and a fatal dose is razor-thin. The medieval monks were unwitting experimenters in a perilous spiritual pharmacology. Today, we recognize the dangers inherent in using potent natural substances without scientific guidance. The penitential salads of the past remind us how faith, medicine, and ignorance can collide with deadly consequences. They reveal a time when the quest to purify the soul led to the slow draining of the body, a sobering chapter in humanity's ongoing struggle to understand health and holiness. As you contemplate the simple salad on your plate, reflect on the bitter legacy of those who ate similar leaves centuries ago, believing their suffering would cleanse not just the body, but the deepest corners of the soul. Their story is a cautionary tale of the delicate balance between healing and harm, faith and folly, life and death. The jelly made from cow's feet and pig skulls served as dessert in the tapestry of medieval cuisine. Few dishes capture the imagination and challenge modern taste buds as vividly as the jellied meat desserts crafted from the most unexpected parts of animals, cows, feet, and pig skulls. This culinary practice, which might seem shocking or even repulsive to contemporary ears, was in fact a highly prized delicacy, reflecting the medieval mastery of resourcefulness, technique, and a very different cultural relationship to food and texture. At the heart of this delicacy lies the remarkable process of transforming humble, often discarded animal parts into a refined and visually arresting dish known as aspic. Far from being merely a practical way to avoid waste, aspic was celebrated as a symbol of culinary sophistication in medieval banquets and aristocratic tables. The gelatinous texture, produced by boiling collagen-rich tissues, was considered both a sign of skill and a treat for those who savored complexity in flavor and form. The primary ingredients, cow's feet and pig skulls, were chosen precisely because of their high collagen content. Collagen, a structural protein found abundantly in connective tissues, when simmered for hours, breaks down and releases gelatin. This gelatin sets into a firm, translucent jelly upon cooling, capable of holding shapes and suspending other ingredients within it. Medieval cooks harnessed this natural chemistry to create molded dishes that dazzled the eye, even as they challenged the palate. Imagine the long, slow cooking process. The feet and skulls submerged in pots of boiling water, often with added spices, herbs, and sometimes wine or vinegar to enhance flavor. Over hours, the broth thickened and began to thicken, with gelatin infusing the liquid with rich, meaty depth. After straining out the solid bones and scraps, the broth was poured into molds, sometimes shaped like fruits or flowers, to cool and set into firm, colorful aspics. The coloring of aspic was an art in itself. Medieval chefs used natural pigments, such as saffron for golden hues, beet juice for reds, or spinach for greens, elevating these meat-based jellies into edible jewels. This visual appeal was vital in an era when food was as much about spectacle and social signaling as it was about nourishment. Serving a molded jelly that resembled a bright fruit or floral arrangement was a testament to the kitchen's skill and the host's wealth, but the texture was the true challenge for modern sensibilities. To us, the rubbery, wobbly consistency of aspic may provoke discomfort or distaste, but to medieval diners, it was a novel and pleasurable sensation, entirely unlike the simpler broths or roasted meats they were accustomed to. The cool firmness, the subtle springiness, and the concentrated flavor all combined to create a multi-sensory experience, blending taste, texture, and appearance. Beyond its role as a culinary delight, aspic held practical importance. In a time before refrigeration, jellied meats could preserve flavor and nutrition longer than plain broth or cooked meat. The gelatin formed a protective seal, slowing spoilage and allowing leftovers to be served days after the initial cooking. This made aspic not only luxurious but also practical in the management of scarce resources. Medieval cookbooks, such as the 14th century form of curry, include recipes hinting at the preparation of such jellied dishes, underscoring their place in high-status meals. Although exact recipes vary, the consistent use of gelatinous animal parts and careful molding techniques reveal a sophisticated culinary knowledge, blending science, art, and tradition. The choice of cow's feet and pig skulls also reflects the medieval ethic of using every part of the animal, minimizing waste in a society where meat was expensive and labor-intensive to procure. What might seem like an odd or unpleasant ingredient today was then transformed into something prized, appreciated, and ceremoniously served. In many ways, aspic embodies the paradox of medieval dining, a world where extravagance and austerity intertwined, where the humble hoof could become a glittering centerpiece, and where texture was as important as flavor. It was a cuisine deeply connected to the rhythms of the seasons, the cycles of life and death, and the rituals of community and hierarchy. Today, while jellied meats have largely fallen out of favor in much of the world, their medieval predecessors remind us of a time when culinary creativity pushed boundaries in ways we might not expect. The aspic served at medieval feasts was not merely food. It was a statement of skill, resourcefulness, and cultural identity. So when you hear of desserts molded from boiled cow's feet and pig skulls, remember that this was not crude survival fare, but a sophisticated, celebrated delicacy and edible testament to the ingenuity and complexity of medieval cooks who transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary. The pancakes made from boiled blood and burnt ash for Lent in the austere landscape of medieval Europe, where religion deeply shaped daily life. The seasons of fasting were marked by rituals that went far beyond simple abstinence. Lent, the solemn period leading up to Easter, demanded strict self-denial and acts of penance, compelling the faithful to engage with food and ritual in ways that conveyed spiritual discipline, mortality, and sacrifice. Among the most striking, yet less known, of these Lenten traditions was the consumption of blood pancakes, a peculiar gritty dish made from boiled blood mixed with ashes or ground fish bones. This food was no ordinary sustenance. It was a physical manifestation of penance and mortality, served in humble homes and monastic cells alike, a grim reminder of the human condition and the sacrifices expected during this sacred time. To understand the significance of these blood pancakes, one must first grasp the medieval worldview, in which food was inseparable from symbolism, theology, and survival. Blood, a substance deeply associated with life and vitality, took on a paradoxical role during Lent. While the faithful refrained from rich foods such as meat and dairy, blood, often from freshly slaughtered animals, was sometimes retained and boiled to make these pancakes. This practice balanced the necessity of nourishment with the ritualistic commitment to simplicity and abstinence. Boiling the blood neutralized some of its richness, transforming it into a humble, dark base that was then mixed with gritty, burnt materials like ashes or pulverized fish bones, ingredients that might seem repellent to modern eyes but were full of symbolic and practical meaning. The ashes added to the batter were not random. They were typically derived from burnt wood or even sacred church fires, carrying the weight of death, purification, and penitence. Ashes symbolized the ephemeral nature of life, a reminder that from dust you came, and to dust you shall return. Incorporating ashes into the blood pancake was a physical enactment of humility, a way for the eater to ingest the stark reality of mortality and spiritual cleansing. The ashes lent the batter its characteristic dark, almost black, hue, and a gritty texture that made each bite a sobering experience. Similarly, ground fish bones were sometimes used in place of ashes, especially in coastal or riverine communities. Fish itself was a common Lenten substitute for meat, blessed with religious significance as a symbol of Christ and his miracles. Crushing fish bones into the pancake batter was an ingenious method of extracting every possible nutrient during times of scarcity, while also intensifying the symbolism. The presence of bones, the remnants of life's structure mixed with blood, underscored the mingling of death and survival, flesh and spirit. The preparation and consumption of these pancakes was an exercise in endurance and spiritual focus. The gritty texture and bitter, smoky flavor contrasted sharply with the rich, indulgent foods that marked other seasons. Yet this dish was more than punishment. It was a spiritual treat, a way to participate tangibly in the sacrifice of Christ, and to embrace the humbling truths of human frailty. Historical accounts and folk traditions attest to the widespread practice of blood pancakes during Lent in various parts of Europe. From Scandinavia to the British Isles, while recipes and exact ingredients varied, the underlying themes remained consistent: a deliberate movement away from luxury, a physical symbol of mortality, and a ritual that connected the eater to a larger cosmic cycle of death and resurrection. In many medieval households, preparing blood pancakes was a communal affair. often involving the entire family in the careful collection of blood from freshly slaughtered animals, the preparation of ashes or fish bones, and the mixing of ingredients in a simple wooden bowl. The batter was then cooked over open hearths, its dark smoke rising as a silent prayer for forgiveness and spiritual renewal. The pancakes were typically eaten plain or with simple accompaniments like herbs or a splash of sour milk, reinforcing their humble, penitential character. Yet even within this austerity, there was a deep celebration of life's cycles. Lent was not merely a time of deprivation, but of preparation, a period to strip away excess and focus on renewal, both physical and spiritual. The blood pancakes, with their stark combination of life's essence and the ashes of death, encapsulated this paradox beautifully. Modern palates might recoil at the thought of eating pancakes made from boiled blood and burnt ash, but in the context of medieval faith and survival, this dish was a profound ritual. It demanded courage and conviction, transforming ordinary ingredients into a sacred meal that nourished body and soul alike. Through this lens, we see that food is never merely food. It is a language, a vessel of meaning, a bridge between the earthly and the divine. The gritty, dark batter of blood pancakes carried with it stories of sacrifice, mortality, and hope. It was a tangible reminder that from the ashes of penance arises the promise of resurrection. As we reflect on this ancient practice, we glimpse a world where the boundaries between sustenance and spirituality blurred, where the harsh realities of survival were interwoven with profound acts of faith. The pancakes made from boiled blood and burnt ash stand as a testament to humanity's enduring quest to find meaning and grace in even the most unlikely places. The fruit pie that was locked with a key and couldn't be touched in the lavish halls of medieval nobility. The dining table was much more than a place to eat. It was a stage where power, wealth, and social order were performed with precision and grandeur. Every object, every dish, carried meaning beyond mere sustenance. Among the many curious spectacles of the medieval feast, one stands out for its paradoxical blend of abundance and restraint. The fruit pie that was padlocked, locked away from hungry hands, untouchable, untasted, an edible symbol of status and control. Imagine a richly carved wooden table draped in fine cloths, flickering candlelight reflecting off gilded goblets and silverware. Amidst plates heaving with roasted meats and steaming breads, there sits a grand fruit pie, its crust glazed and embossed with intricate patterns. This was no ordinary pie. It was heavily spiced with exotic ingredients like cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and saffron, many of which were rare and costly, imported from distant lands. The pie was sealed, not just with dough, but physically locked with a small padlock, a key kept closely by the lord or lady of the house. The message was unmistakable. This pie was to be admired, not eaten. Why would anyone display a delicious, expensive pie, yet forbid it from being touched? To understand this, we must enter the mindset of medieval elites, where ostentation, symbolism, and ritual often trumped practicality. The locked fruit pie was a tangible demonstration of wealth, self-control, and refined taste. It proclaimed to all present that this household possessed not only the means to acquire rare spices and costly ingredients, but also the discipline to resist indulgence. In a society where feasts were as much about spectacle as sustenance, the locked pie became a paradoxical trophy of abundance and restraint. Spices in medieval Europe were far more than flavor enhancers. They were status symbols, traded along perilous routes from Asia and the Middle East. To fill a pie with these precious substances was an expensive act, signaling connections and access to global wealth. Displaying such a pie, locked and untouched, was a form of silent boasting. It said, "See what we have, but also see what we deny ourselves," proving our superior control and prestige. It was the culinary equivalent of a jeweled crown, locked safely away, valued for its rarity and symbolism, not for casual use. This ritual of locking food also reflects the complex relationship medieval elites had with consumption, morality, and power. Feasts were not mere banquets. They were governed by strict codes. Gluttony was a sin, yet extravagance was expected. The locked pie embodied this tension, revealing a performance of virtue wrapped in luxury. It invited admiration without temptation, a constant reminder of the power to command resources without succumbing to base desires. Moreover, the locked pie played a social role in the hierarchy of the banquet. Guests could gaze upon it, marvel at its craftsmanship and exotic contents, but none could claim it. The key symbolized control over resources, over desires, and over the social order itself. It reinforced the idea that the noble host was a guardian of not just wealth, but moral authority. The pie became a silent witness to feudal power dynamics, asserting the lord's supremacy in both material and spiritual realms. Historians note that such locked dishes were part of broader medieval traditions where food presentation was intertwined with ritualized behavior. For example, elaborate pies might contain live birds released upon slicing, a spectacle of surprise and wonder. But the locked fruit pie was a different kind of marvel, a static emblem of wealth and restraint, frozen in time on the banquet table. This phenomenon also speaks to the medieval fascination with secrets and locks as symbols of mystery and privilege. Just as castle gates and treasury chests were locked to protect valuables, so too was this pie guarded, transformed from food into a treasured object. It was a culinary metaphor for exclusivity and inaccessibility, an edible art piece locked behind a barrier of social meaning. In a world where food scarcity and famine were harsh realities for many, the locked pie's presence must have sent a clear message. It was a reminder that some belonged to a class so privileged that they could afford to display abundance without the need to consume it. It also subtly reinforced social divisions. While common folk struggled for daily bread, nobles could indulge in luxury's theater, turning even untouched food into symbols of power. As time passed and culinary fashions evolved, the locked fruit pie faded into obscurity. But its legacy remains a compelling testament to the complex ways medieval societies used food not only to nourish bodies, but also to construct identity, hierarchy, and control. It challenges us to see food beyond calories and taste, as a language of power spoken in crust and spice. So, the next time you think of a fruit pie, imagine one locked tight on a medieval table, an untouchable jewel of flavor and wealth, a silent proclamation that sometimes the greatest feast is the one that is never eaten. The medieval meal, where nothing looked like what it was in the great halls of medieval castles. Dining was far more than sustenance, it was spectacle, art, and a battleground of wits and status. Among the most astonishing culinary marvels was the feast of illusion food, where nothing looked like what it truly was. Fish were dyed to mimic bright fruits, meats sculpted to resemble delicate birds, and eggs fashioned from almond paste stood in for the real thing. This was a banquet designed to deceive the senses and dazzle guests, weaving edible magic that blurred the line between reality and imagination. Medieval cooks were master illusionists. With limited technology but boundless creativity, they transformed ordinary ingredients into extraordinary visual riddles. This culinary artistry was deeply tied to the culture of feasting, a language of power where appearance held equal weight to taste. To impress nobles and visiting dignitaries, cooks crafted dishes that challenged perceptions, inviting guests into a world where food became theater. One common trick was dyeing fish to resemble fruit. Brightly colored fish, often boiled or roasted, were soaked or coated in vibrant natural dyes extracted from plants, spices, or minerals. Imagine a pale cod turning a rich red or purple, mimicking the luscious hues of berries or plums. The contrast between expectation and reality sparked surprise and conversation, proving the cook's skill and the host's wealth. Meat sculpting was another marvel. Skilled kitchen artisans shaped cuts of beef, pork, or poultry into the likeness of birds or small animals. Feathers might be mimicked with slivers of vegetables or pastry leaves. The dish was both a feast for the eyes and a puzzle for the palate. Guests marveled at the uncanny realism, then tasted to discover the transformation beneath. This blending of visual art and gastronomy was a signature of high medieval cuisine. Perhaps most enchanting were the almond paste eggs. Almonds ground into a fine paste, sweetened and molded, became convincing replicas of real eggs, sometimes painted or dusted with natural colors. These delicate confections appeared alongside savory courses, confusing and delighting diners. Reflected the era's fascination with confectionery, which was evolving into a respected culinary craft. These illusions were not mere frivolities. They carried symbolic and social weight. Medieval feasts were orchestrated events reinforcing hierarchy and prestige. Presenting food that challenged reality was a demonstration of mastery over ingredients, technique, and perception. It was a statement that the host commanded resources, talent, and creativity beyond ordinary reach. The art of deception extended beyond appearance. Flavors and textures were carefully manipulated to sustain the illusion. Sweetness might lurk where savory was expected, or a tender fruit-like exterior might conceal a firm, meaty interior. The multi-sensory experience tested guests' expectations and heightened their engagement, making dining a form of entertainment and intellectual play. Medieval cookbooks and manuscripts from the time, like the form of curry compiled by the cooks of King Richard II, include recipes for elaborate dishes designed to astonish, instructions for coloring fish with saffron or cochineal, shaping meats into fantastic forms, and preparing almond pastes for sweets showcased the high level of culinary artistry achieved. These recipes weren't just about nourishment, but about spectacle and social theater. The fascination with illusion in food reflects broader medieval values. The world was understood through symbolism and allegory. Appearances often masked deeper truths. Just as in art and literature, food became a medium to play with identity, deception, and revelation. The Feast of Illusion food echoed this cultural landscape, inviting diners to look beyond the surface. This dining style also illustrates the medieval elite's desire to assert control over nature and reality. By manipulating food into surprising forms and colors, they demonstrated dominion over the natural world and the ability to bend perception. It was a metaphor for power shaping not only the physical, but the very experience of reality. Despite the extravagance these meals were demanding to prepare, creating convincing illusions required time, skill, and rare ingredients. The use of natural dyes, meticulous carving, and delicate confectionery pushed the limits of medieval culinary technology. Only the wealthiest households could afford such lavish deception. Over time, as culinary tastes evolved and new food preservation and preparation methods emerged, the appetite for illusion waned. Modern dining values freshness and authenticity, often rejecting deception. Yet, the medieval feast of illusion food remains a fascinating testament to human creativity and the timeless desire to surprise and delight. It challenges us to reconsider food, not just as nourishment, but as an experience, a statement, and an art form. When you imagine a pale fish painted crimson like a berry, or a slab of meat transformed into a lifelike bird, you glimpse a world where dining was a dance between reality and fantasy. In the end, the medieval meal, where nothing looked like what it was, stands as a vivid chapter in culinary history. It reveals a culture that reveled in sensory play, social display, and the enchantment of edible deception, reminding us that food has always been about more than flavor. It has been about storytelling, spectacle, and the subtle power of illusion. The water that had to be boiled with bread and onion to be safe in the grim realities of medieval life. Survival often hinged on the simplest, most unassuming practices born out of necessity and harsh circumstance. Among these was a humble ritual repeated daily by peasants across Europe, boiling stale bread with onions or leeks to create what was known as pottage, a thin, watery broth that was far more than just food. It was a crucial survival fluid, a lifeline in a world where clean drinking water was rare, dangerous, and often deadly. Water, something so vital and taken for granted today, was in medieval times a potential killer. Rivers, wells, and streams that supplied villages were frequently contaminated by human waste, animal carcasses, and runoff from farms. With no knowledge of germ theory or modern sanitation, the peasantry faced a constant threat from waterborne diseases. dysentery, cholera, typhoid, and countless infections that could wipe out entire communities. Drinking unboiled water was an act of risk, often a gamble with death. Faced with this peril, medieval peasants developed practical, if rudimentary, methods to make water safer to consume. One of the most common solutions was to boil water with stale bread, often hard, dried loaves left over from previous meals, and combine it with pungent herbs like leeks or onions. This concoction, called pottage, was a thin soup or broth that served multiple purposes. It was not only a food source, albeit meager and watery, but also a way to sterilize water through boiling, reducing its dangers. The process was straightforward but vital. Bread, which otherwise might have gone to waste, was broken into pieces and added to boiling water, along with chopped onions or leeks. As the mixture simmered, the water absorbed flavors and nutrients, while the heat killed many of the microbes lurking in contaminated sources. The onions and leeks added vitamins and minerals, as well as natural antiseptic properties known even then in folk medicine. The result was a watery broth that could sustain a family when solid food was scarce and the purity of water was suspect. Pottage became so ingrained in peasant life that it was more than sustenance. It was an essential survival fluid in times of famine, siege, or harsh winters when crops failed and food was scarce. Pottage was often the sole source of nutrition. Though bland and thin, it was both food and drink combined, a lifeline against starvation and disease. This culinary practice reflects the intersection of necessity, resourcefulness, and the limitations of medieval knowledge. Without microscopes or science, peasants discovered empirically that boiling water with bread and onions made it safer to drink. Though they did not understand microbes, they understood the consequences of drinking raw water. They understood that pottage kept families alive. Records from medieval household accounts, monastery kitchens, and even literature of the time mention pottage repeatedly. It was often the staple of the poor, described as monotonous and unsatisfying, but for the wealthy, pottage might be enriched with meat or vegetables. But for peasants, it was typically just bread and onion broth, thin but vital. The very ingredients speak volumes about medieval scarcity and economy. Stale bread, a byproduct of hard labor and frugality, was never discarded lightly. Onions and leeks, easy to grow and store, were inexpensive sources of flavor and health benefits. Combined with water, these ingredients formed a simple yet effective meal. The significance of boiling water extends beyond mere cooking. It was an early form of public health, a small but powerful measure to combat disease without understanding its true cause. While peasants could not eliminate contaminated water sources, they could make their consumption safer. This practice likely prevented countless deaths from waterborne illnesses, even if the precise mechanism remained a mystery. In a world where illness could strike suddenly and devastate a family, pottage was a small hope, a daily ritual that embodied survival and resilience. It reminds us how human beings adapt to their environment, developing traditions and practices that blend practicality with the limits of their understanding. Today, we view clean water as a basic human right and a given in most parts of the world. But centuries ago, a broth of boiled bread and onions was a precious shield against invisible killers. The story of pottage is a testament to human ingenuity. In the face of adversity, a tale of how the simplest foods carried the weight of life and death. So, next time you sip a simple broth or enjoy a humble soup, remember the medieval peasant whose survival depended on boiling stale bread with onions in water, transforming contaminated, dangerous liquid into a meal, a medicine, and a lifeline. The black pudding made with stale ale and sheep's lung curd in the harsh and unforgiving world of medieval Europe. Food was more than mere nourishment. It was survival, culture, and identity, all woven into one. Among the many peculiar and resourceful dishes developed to sustain bodies and souls, one stands out for its unusual composition and enduring legacy. Black pudding made with stale ale and sheep's lung curd. This was not a delicacy for the faint-hearted, nor for those accustomed to modern cuisine, but a hearty, high-calorie staple that countless medieval people swore by, despite its challenging aroma and appearance. Black pudding, broadly understood as a blood sausage, has roots tracing back to ancient times. But in the medieval period, it evolved into a dish uniquely adapted to local ingredients and culinary practices. In many rural and urban settings alike, it was a way to use every part of the animal, reflecting a broader ethic of frugality and respect for the animal's sacrifice. Sheep's lungs rich in protein and iron were an essential component, often combined with curdled milk and grains like barley to produce a filling, nutritious food. The inclusion of stale ale in the recipe is especially intriguing. Ale was a staple drink for medieval people of all classes, consumed daily not only for pleasure but also because it was often safer than water. Stale ale, or ale that had begun to sour or ferment further, was rarely wasted. Instead, it was incorporated into cooking to add flavor and acidity. In black pudding, the stale ale helped to tenderize the mixture, imparting a subtle temperature that balanced the rich, earthy flavors of blood and offal. Curdled milk, another key ingredient, added texture and protein. It was a byproduct of milk that had thickened or soured, and while it might be discarded in modern kitchens, medieval cooks saw it as an opportunity. Mixed with barley and other grains, the curds helped bind the sausage filling, contributing to its dense, satisfying consistency. This combination made black pudding a highly caloric and sustaining food critical for laborers, shepherds, and anyone engaged in strenuous work. Cooking black pudding was both a skill and a ritual. The filling consisting of finely chopped sheep's lungs, curdled milk, stale ale, barley, and seasoned blood was carefully stuffed into cleaned intestines or stomach linings, which acted as natural casings. The sausages were then boiled or steamed, a slow process that melded flavors and ensured safety in an age before refrigeration or modern sanitation. Serving black pudding warm was customary, releasing its rich aroma and softening its texture. Yet, the smell was notorious strong, pungent, and sometimes overwhelming to those unaccustomed to awful dishes. Medieval texts occasionally reference this, with some writers humorously or disparagingly noting the powerful scent that wafted from kitchens and markets where black pudding was prepared. Despite this, black pudding was beloved across social strata. For peasants and workers, it was an affordable, calorie-dense meal that provided long-lasting energy. For the wealthy, it could be a delicacy, sometimes enriched with spices like cinnamon or cloves, demonstrating the versatility of the dish. It was also commonly eaten during festivals and religious fasts, when meat was restricted, but blood and offal were permitted, further embedding black pudding in cultural traditions. The dish's endurance is a testament to its practical and symbolic importance. It encapsulated medieval ingenuity, transforming less desirable animal parts and leftover ingredients into something nourishing and even celebrated. This black pudding was more than sustenance. It was a culinary expression of the times, blending necessity with craft. Modern palates might recoil at the idea of eating lung curd or stale ale-infused sausages, but understanding black pudding, in its historical context, reveals a world where flavor, nutrition, and survival converged. It reminds us how food customs evolve and adapt, and how something as humble as blood sausage can carry the weight of history, culture, and human resilience. In every bite of that warm, dense black pudding lay centuries of tradition, resourcefulness, and the indomitable spirit of medieval dish that, despite its smell and ingredients, was a source of comfort, strength, and identity for many. The butter that was buried in peat bogs and dug up years later in the mist-shrouded landscapes of ancient and medieval northern Europe. Among the peat bogs that carpeted the lands of Ireland, Scotland, and parts of Scandinavia, there existed a peculiar and fascinating tradition: the burial of butter deep underground, in the acidic, oxygen-poor environment of peat bogs, to ferment and preserve it for years, sometimes decades, before being unearthed and consumed. This curious substance, now known as bog butter, offers a window into the resourcefulness, ritual, and tastes of our ancestors. revealing a complex relationship between food preservation, survival, and even social status. Bog butter was not ordinary butter, it was churned milk fat, often molded into large, dense lumps, and then carefully wrapped, sometimes in animal hides, wooden containers, or bark, before being buried beneath the layers of peat. Peat bogs, composed of partially decayed organic matter, created a cold, anaerobic environment that slowed decomposition, allowing the butter to ferment and age in a manner unlike any dairy product stored above ground. The exact reasons for burying butter in this way remain debated among historians and archaeologists, but several compelling theories offer insight into this ancient practice. Firstly, bog butter served as a method of preservation in a time before refrigeration. Dairy products are highly perishable, and the nutrient-rich fat could spoil quickly in temperate climates. Burying butter in peat bogs provided a natural cold storage that was remarkably effective in keeping it edible for extended periods. The chemical composition of peat, rich in tannins and acids, helped inhibit bacterial growth, while the oxygen-poor conditions prevented rancidity and decay in ways that modern refrigeration achieves artificially. Secondly, bog butter likely functioned as a form of food insurance or wealth storage. Butter was a valuable commodity, a source of calories, fats, and flavor. By burying it, families or communities could safeguard surplus butter for times of scarcity, famine, or hardship. Unearthing a lump of bog butter after several years was akin to discovering a hidden treasure, one that could sustain the household or be traded for other goods. This practice underscores the practical and economic dimensions of food storage. In pre-industrial societies, where seasonal abundance was fragile and unpredictable, but bog butter was more than just practical. It was culturally significant. Some scholars suggest that the act of burying butter in peat bogs may have carried ritualistic or symbolic meanings. Peat bogs themselves were often seen as liminal spaces, thresholds between the earthly world and the spiritual realm. Depositing valuable foods like butter into these mysterious wet earth layers could be interpreted as offerings to the gods, spirits, or ancestors, a way of seeking protection, fertility, or blessings. Archaeological discoveries of bog butter in sacred or communal sites reinforce the idea that this was not merely a matter of convenience, but also an expression of cultural beliefs. When bog butter was eventually dug up, sometimes decades later, its appearance and smell were challenging to modern sensibilities. The butter would often have darkened to a deep brown or black color, its texture altered by the fermentation process, and its aroma described as pungent, earthy, and intense, a blend of decay and richness that could be off-putting but was valued by those accustomed to its qualities. Consuming bog butter was an acquired taste, reserved for those who could appreciate its uniqueness and who understood its connection to heritage and survival. Scientific analysis of bog butter samples recovered from archaeological sites reveals fascinating biochemical transformations. The fats break down into distinctive compounds, producing flavors that are both complex and enigmatic. Somewhere between aged cheese and fermented dairy, with smoky and savory undertones. Modern chefs and food historians have even attempted to recreate bog butter, seeking to capture its ancient flavors and bring this remarkable culinary tradition back to life. In a world without refrigerators or modern preservation techniques, bog butter exemplifies the ingenuity of our ancestors. It represents a profound interaction with the natural environment, where the acidic, chilly peatlands became a partner in the art of fermentation and storage. This interplay of human skill and nature's unique conditions created a product that was both sustenance and symbol, a testament to resilience in harsh climates, and an emblem of cultural identity. The story of bog butter also invites reflection on how food connects us across time. When we unearth these ancient lumps of churned fat, we uncover more than just a preserved dairy product. We uncover narratives of survival, economy, spirituality, and taste. Bog butter is a relic of a world where every resource was precious, where food was wrapped in ritual and necessity, and where the boundary between life and decay was navigated with careful hands and deep reverence. Today, Bog butter reminds us that culinary heritage is not always neat or palatable by modern standards. It challenges us to expand our understanding of flavor, preservation, and tradition, to appreciate the strange, pungent, and ancient delicacies that sustained generations long before the conveniences of the present day. It is a reminder that sometimes, to taste the past, one must endure the smell of the earth itself. The salt that was so valuable, it was locked in personal pouches. Salt, the simple crystalline mineral that seasons our food today, was once one of the most precious and fiercely guarded commodities in human history. More than just a flavor enhancer, salt was a lifeline essential for preserving food, sustaining health, and even symbolizing loyalty and trust. So valuable was salt in many societies that diners carried their own personal salt with them, locked away in small carved bone or metal containers, their most prized possession during meals and travels. Sharing your salt was not a casual act, it was a profound gesture of trust. Conversely, stealing salt could ignite bitter feuds and bloodshed. To understand this extraordinary reverence for salt, we must travel back to an era when salt was scarce, difficult to produce, and costly to transport. Unlike today's industrial-scale mining and production, salt was harvested through laborious methods: evaporating seawater under the sun, mining rock salt deep underground, or extracting it from salt springs. Each method demanded time, skill, and often danger, especially in regions far from natural salt sources. Consequently, salt acquired immense economic value, sometimes rivaling gold, and became a currency unto itself. In medieval Europe and other parts of the world, salt was a strategic resource vital to food preservation. Without refrigeration, salting was the primary method to cure meat and fish, allowing communities to store food through harsh winters and long journeys. Losing access to salt could mean famine and death. This elevated salt beyond mere seasoning into a symbol of survival and security. Because of its value, salt was tightly controlled by authorities and often taxed heavily. Salt taxes could be crushing burdens on common folk, as seen in historical events like the French gabelle tax that spurred unrest. Given this scarcity and expense, individuals guarding their own salt became a necessity, especially travelers, merchants, and nobles who could not rely on others for this essential commodity. Personal salt pouches emerged as practical and symbolic items: small, exquisitely carved containers fashioned from bone, ivory, or metal, designed to securely hold a precious supply of salt. These pouches were locked or sealed to prevent theft, emphasizing the salt's value and the owner's vigilance. Bringing one's own salt to the table was a statement of status and self-reliance. Unlike today's communal salt shakers, medieval diners did not expect salt to be freely available. The very act of sharing salt was laden with meaning. To invite someone to share your salt pouch was to extend a gesture of friendship, alliance, or loyalty, a bond forged in necessity and trust. In many cultures, this sacred sharing transcended food. It was a ritual seal of hospitality and fraternity. Conversely, to steal salt or deny its sharing could provoke deep resentment, breeding conflict and feuds between families or communities. The salt pouch thus became a talisman of both sustenance and social currency. Historical records and archaeological finds reveal how prized these salt containers were, intricately carved with symbolic motifs. Enamels, geometric patterns, or heraldic signs. Salt pouches reflected the owner's identity and social standing. They were often passed down through generations, treasured heirlooms, as well as practical tools. The presence of a locked salt pouch in one's possession underscored a double vigilance, guarding not just a physical substance, but a key to survival and social negotiation. This intense guarding of salt echoes the profound role it played in medieval and early modern economies. Entire trade routes and wars revolved around salt access. Towns grew wealthy controlling salt mines or salt works. Some salt roads, such as the Via Salaria in Italy, were lifelines connecting producers and consumers. The control and distribution of salt could make or break kingdoms. Against this backdrop, the intimate act of carrying and locking salt in personal pouches takes on added resonance, a microcosm of the larger economic and social dynamics of the time. Salt's symbolism extended into culture and language. The phrase "not worth one's salt" denoted value and labor. Salt of the earth praised humble worth and reliability. Sharing salt became emblematic of fidelity and sacred bonds. In some rituals, salt was sprinkled or exchanged to seal agreements or ward off evil. This cultural weight only intensified the significance of those locked pouches on the dining table. In a world where food scarcity was a constant threat, and survival often hinged on preservation and preparation, salt was a precious treasure to be guarded fiercely. The locked salt pouch, small enough to fit in a pocket but carrying immense symbolic and practical weight, was a medieval security system, a social contract, and a mark of identity all in one. Today, with salt ubiquitous and cheap, it's hard to imagine a time when salt theft could spark violence or sharing salt-sealed alliances. Yet these locked pouches remind us that behind every simple crystal lies a complex human story of survival, economy, trust, and power. They are silent witnesses to a time when even the smallest grains could determine life and death. So, next time you sprinkle salt on your meal, remember the centuries when salt was worth its weight in gold, locked in personal pouches, and shared only with those trusted most. It's a story of human ingenuity and social bonds, wrapped in the crystalline heart of this ancient mineral. The wine that was heated with nails and animal guts before drinking in the shadowed taverns and bustling courts of medieval Europe. Wine was far more than a simple drink. It was a potent elixir, medicine, and symbol of vitality. Among the most curious and intense concoctions was mulled wine, heated not just with spices, but with iron nails, animal intestines, and rare herbs, all simmered in heavy bronze pots. This blend was believed to infuse the wine with strength and healing power, blurring the line between beverage and remedy. Medieval medicine was rooted in humoral theory, a complex system balancing bodily fluids to maintain health. Food and drink played a crucial role in restoring this balance. Wine, warm and spiced, was considered excellent for digestion, circulation, and warding off cold ailments. Yet, beyond common mulling spices like cinnamon and cloves, some recipes included startling ingredients: heated iron nails and animal guts meant to add physical and symbolic potency. Iron nails were heated, red hot, and plunged into the wine. This fiery ritual was thought to transfer the metal's strength and hot quality to the drink, reinforcing the body's warmth and vigor. Iron itself was associated with robustness and protection, especially against supernatural forces. The sizzling sound and metallic aroma enhanced the sensory impact, marking the wine as a powerful tonic. Animal intestines or guts were sometimes added, typically cleaned and boiled, to release gelatin and nutrients. These parts symbolized life force and vitality, their presence believed to stimulate digestion and fortify internal organs. While it may seem unsettling today, the inclusion of such elements reflected a worldview where the body's parts contained curative properties, and consuming them in transformed form offered health benefits. These ingredients were heated in bronze vessels, prized for their durability and ability to conduct heat evenly. Bronze pots held symbolic and practical significance. Metalwork was associated with alchemy and transformation, making the cooking process itself a kind of ritual. The mingling of metal, animal, and plant matter in a simmering bath created a complex, layered potion. Rare herbs, sometimes wild and exotic, were added to enhance flavor and medicinal effects. Ingredients like wormwood, hyssop, or sage carried reputations as digestive aids and protectors against disease. Their bitterness balanced the sweetness of the wine and the pungency of other components, weaving a tapestry of taste that was as therapeutic as it was intoxicating. This mulled wine served multiple functions. As a drink, it warmed the body in cold climates and convivial settings. As medicine, it soothed digestive troubles, stimulated appetite, and restored energy after illness. As ritual, it reinforced social bonds, signaling care, hospitality, and knowledge of healing arts. To drink, it was to partake in a tradition where food, health, and culture intertwined deeply. The sensory experience was rich and evocative. The sharp hiss of iron meeting liquid, the earthy aroma of herbs and broth, the thick mouthfeel from animal gelatinol combined to engage senses beyond taste alone. The drinker was immersed in a moment where nature's raw power was harnessed and refined through human skill. Historical texts, including medical treatises and cookbooks, attest to such preparations. Physicians recommended warming wines with metals and animal extracts as part of complex treatment regimens. Tavern keepers and apothecaries alike brewed versions tailored to local ingredients and customs. Though recipes varied, the underlying belief in the restorative power of these infusions was widespread. This practice reveals much about medieval attitudes toward health and consumption. The boundaries between food, medicine, and magic were fluid. Healing was a holistic art, combining material substances with ritual action and symbolism. Strengthening the body required not only nourishment, but the invocation of elemental forces, symbolized by iron's hardness and animal vitality. As time progressed, medical understanding evolved, and tastes changed. The use of nails and animal guts in mulled wine faded, replaced by more palatable spices and modern pharmacology. Yet the legacy remains a fascinating glimpse into a world where every sip carried meaning beyond flavor, a world where drink was a conduit for health, power, and tradition. Reflecting on this medieval mulled wine challenges modern notions of cuisine and medicine. It invites us to see history not merely as distant oddities, but as expressions of human attempts to harness nature, heal the body, and create communal rituals. The heated nails, the simmering guts, the fragrant herbs, they tell a story of transformation, where the humble cup became a vessel of life and strength. So next time you warm a spiced wine by the fire, imagine the ancient hands stirring a bronze pot, plunging glowing iron into dark liquid, and adding secret herbs and animal essences. You are sipping a potion forged at the crossroads of science, superstition, and hospitality, a taste of medieval life's complex, potent brew. The banquet, where guests had to catch their food mid-air. Picture a grand medieval hall filled with flickering candlelight, the clinking of goblets, and the murmur of nobles gathered for a feast. Yet, this is no ordinary banquet. Instead of trays laden with neatly served dishes, the guests find themselves engaged in a lively, chaotic spectacle where food is not handed, but launched. Small meatballs, pies, and delicacies are catapulted across the room, forcing nobles to catch their dinner mid-air. This was the bizarre and uproarious world of interactive feasting, where jesters and cooks transformed the banquet into a game of skill, laughter, and occasional embarrassment. Medieval banquets were not simply meals, they were performances, stages where power, prestige, and wit were displayed. Nobles used feasting to cement alliances, flaunt wealth, and indulge in the pleasures of excess. Yet beyond the formal toasts and grand courses lay a culture of entertainment that often blurred the lines between celebration and spectacle. One such entertainment involved jesters, professional fools skilled in humor, acrobatics, and mischief, collaborating with cooks to devise playful challenges for the guests. Instead of the conventional serving of food, jesters would catapult small morsels of meat or savory pies across the hall, transforming the act of dining into an unpredictable event. Guests were expected not only to eat, but to catch or retrieve their flying food, turning the feast into a lively contest of reflexes and agility. This practice served multiple purposes. For the hosts, it was a way to break the stiffness of courtly rituals and encourage merriment and camaraderie. For the guests, it was a test of dexterity and composure. Failure to catch a flying meatball might lead to laughter, teasing, or social embarrassment. The spectacle united nobles in shared amusement, turning the banquet hall into a stage for playful competition. Historical accounts and chroniclers describe such events with a mixture of fascination and amusement. The throwing of food was often choreographed, with jesters timing their launches to maximize surprise and hilarity. Sometimes, the meatballs were small and manageable, Other times, entire pies were flung, requiring daring dives or quick grabs. The more adept a guest, the more prestige they earned. The less coordinated risked becoming the subject of good-natured ridicule. This theatrical feasting reflected the medieval appetite for novelty and distraction in courtly life. Nobility, trapped within rigid hierarchies and formalities, sought moments of levity and human connection. The flying food became a medium for social interaction beyond mere conversation. An icebreaker that dissolved barriers and created stories told long after the banquet ended. Yet, beneath the fun lay subtle layers of meaning. The unpredictability of catching one's meal symbolized the volatility of courtly favor and fortune. Just as food flew through the air, so too could power and status shift unexpectedly. Participating in the game was a reminder of the delicate balance nobles maintained between dignity and folly. The practice also underscored an abundance of medieval feasts. Food was plentiful enough to be used not just for sustenance, but for spectacle. This abundance contrasted starkly with the scarcity faced by peasants, highlighting the social divide of the time. Banquets were stages to display wealth, not only through the quality of food, but through the freedom to waste or play with it. In some instances, jesters would escalate the game with added challenges, throwing food blindfolded, requiring guests to catch with specific hands, or even tossing objects at unexpected intervals. Such antics intensified the laughter and camaraderie, turning the dining experience into memorable theater. The tradition of interactive feasting with flying food gradually faded with the rise of more formal dining customs and changing tastes. However, echoes of this playful spirit linger in modern celebrations where games, surprises, and performances accompany meals. Reflecting on these medieval banquets reveals much about human nature and society. It shows how even in times of rigid hierarchy and ceremony, people crave joy, playfulness, and connection. The flying meatballs and pies remind us that food is not just nourishment, but a social and cultural catalyst, capable of transforming even the most formal gatherings into moments of shared laughter and humanity. So imagine yourself in that grand hall, eyes wide as a savory pie arcs through the air, arms ready to catch your dinner. In that moment of anticipation, humor, and skill, the medieval feast becomes a celebration not just of food, but of life's unpredictability and delight. The feast where every course was a puzzle you had to solve, in the grand halls of medieval castles and noble manors. Feasts were far more than mere gatherings for eating. They were spectacles of art, power, and intellect. Among the most fascinating and enigmatic culinary traditions of this era was the practice of serving meals where each course arrived as a puzzle, a riddle to be solved before the first bite. These elaborate feasts were not simply about nourishment. They were intricate performances that tested wit, knowledge, and the keen eye of every guest. Imagine a great hall filled with courtiers, nobles, and honored guests seated around a long, candlelit table. Servants bring forth covered dishes cloaked in mystery shapes that defy expectation, colors that hint at hidden meanings, and elaborate presentations that mask their true contents. The meal before them is a game, a challenge, a celebration of mystery and meaning woven into the very fabric of dining. This tradition, while seemingly whimsical to modern sensibilities, was deeply rooted in medieval culture's love for symbolism, allegory, and intellectual play. The medieval mind delighted in riddles, puzzles, and coded messages, whether in literature, art, or even food. To partake in a feast, where courses were disguised and required interpretation, was to engage fully with this culture's complex relationship with knowledge and power. Dishes might arrive covered in pastry shaped like fantastical animals or mythical creatures, forcing guests to deduce what meat or filling lay hidden beneath the crust. Some courses were cloaked in colorful sauces that hinted at spices or ingredients from distant lands, evoking stories of trade and conquest. Others came molded into symbolic shapes, roses, stars, or heraldic emblems, each bearing layered meanings tied to the host's lineage or aspirations. The challenge was more than entertainment. It was a social ritual. Guests who correctly guessed the ingredients or the symbolic significance of a dish gained honor and favor, while failure could invite gentle mockery or playful ribbing. This intellectual engagement turned the meal into a battlefield of minds, as much as a feast for the body. Moreover, these puzzle courses served practical purposes. They masked less desirable ingredients in lavish presentations, turning humble or unexpected foods into captivating enigmas. In an age when the element of surprise and novelty was prized, such creativity dazzled diners and underscored the host's generosity and sophistication. Historical records and medieval cookery manuscripts describe recipes and presentations that align with this enigmatic dining style. For instance, pies shaped like ships or animals were popular, often containing unexpected fillings such as mixtures of sweet and savory or unusual game. The spectacle of cutting into such a pie was part performance, part revelation. Beyond the visual and gustatory mystery, some feasts incorporated verbal riddles or poems that guests had to interpret to unlock the meaning of the course. This intertwining of language and food heightened the sense of communal engagement and elevated the meal into a multi-sensory theatrical event. This custom also reflected the medieval worldview, where the line between reality and allegory was fluid, and food, like stories and symbols, conveyed deeper truths. Dining was an active participation in a larger narrative reminder that beneath appearances lay hidden meanings waiting to be uncovered. For the hosts, orchestrating such a feast was a demonstration of power, education, and wealth. It required skilled chefs, knowledgeable servers, and guests who were not mere consumers, but active players in the unfolding drama. To master this art was to command respect and admiration in courts where wit was as valued as wealth. To modern audiences, this might sound like a whimsical fantasy, but it was a very real tradition that shaped how food was experienced and understood in the medieval world. These feasts blurred the boundaries between sustenance and spectacle, nourishment and knowledge, pleasure and puzzle. So when we look back at these mysterious medieval meals, we glimpse a culture where eating was a game, a test, and a ritual. Each course a secret to be unveiled, each bite a reward for intellect and insight. It was a feast, not just for the stomach, but for the mind and soul, a celebration of mystery served on a silver platter. The feast that ended with eating sculptures made of sugar and bone in the grand halls of medieval Europe. Banquets were more than mere meals, they were theatrical displays of wealth, power, and artistry. These lavish feasts served as a stage for nobles and royalty to assert status, impress guests, and celebrate the richness of life through abundance and spectacle. But beyond the roasted meats, overflowing goblets, and rich spices, there existed a final act of culinary drama so extraordinary that it blurred the boundaries between food and art. The feast's finale was often an elaborate presentation of edible sculptures, intricately crafted towers of sugar, bones arranged into arboreal shapes, and even armor fashioned to be both ornamental and consumable. These magnificent creations, known variously as subtleties or entremets, were the crowning glory of the medieval banquet. They transformed the dining experience into a sensory and symbolic journey, weaving narratives of myth, power, and divine, right into edible forms. Sugar, then a rare and precious commodity imported at great expense, was molded into elaborate shapes, castles, birds, mythical beasts, glittering like jewels under flickering candlelight. The crystalline sweetness was not only a decadent treat, but a statement of luxury, signaling the host's access to far-flung trade networks and immense wealth. But sugar alone was not the only medium. Bones, often from game or poultry, cleaned, bleached, and artistically assembled into arboreal sculptures or abstract shapes that resembled trees, candelabras, or architectural forms. These bone sculptures held a dual purpose. They were both decorative and symbolic, reflecting themes of mortality, life cycles, and the natural order, all while being entirely edible. Sometimes, the bones were combined with sugar and other foodstuffs to create composite sculptures, blurring the lines between the macabre and the sublime. One of the most spectacular feats of culinary artistry was the creation of edible armor, life-sized or miniature suits, fashioned to resemble the knightly garb of the host or their guests. Crafted from sugar paste, marzipan, and sometimes reinforced with delicate bone or pastry structures, these armors were astonishingly detailed. They celebrated the chivalric ideals of the age, evoking honor, valor, and protection, while inviting guests to partake in their dismantling. The act of breaking apart these sculptures and consuming them was laden with reverence and symbolism, ritualistic devouring of art and status, a moment where the ephemerality of power was tasted literally and figuratively. Historical records and contemporary accounts describe how these edible sculptures were displayed prominently at the feast's conclusion, captivating guests with their intricacy and scale. The dining hall, often adorned with tapestries and heraldic banners, became a gallery of transient art where food was elevated beyond sustenance to a cultural expression. The breaking and eating of these sculptures was a communal act, a shared celebration of abundance and transience, underscoring the fleeting nature of earthly pleasures and human achievement. Crafting these sculptures required highly skilled artisans, known as confectioners or sucrus, whose mastery of sugarwork and food preparation was unrivaled. Their knowledge of techniques such as sugar pulling, molding, and casting was passed down through generations. Combining culinary expertise with artistic vision, these artisans were essential to the spectacle, turning humble ingredients into majestic masterpieces that dazzled guests and left lasting impressions. The inclusion of bones in these sculptures also reflected the medieval fascination with the body and mortality. Bones were tangible reminders of life's fragility and death's inevitability, themes deeply embedded in medieval art, literature, and religion. Their transformation into decorative elements for festive banquets created a paradoxical interplay between celebration and contemplation, indulgence and asceticism. To consume these sculptures was to engage in an act rich with meaning. It was a symbolic consumption of beauty, power, and impermanence. As guests broke apart the towers, trees, and armor, they participated in a ritual that acknowledged the temporality of material splendor. The edible art, designed to be admired and devoured, embodied the medieval world view where earthly glory is fleeting, yet worthy of grand celebration. In the modern imagination, the notion of eating sculptures made of sugar and bone might evoke a sense of wonder mixed with unease. Yet in the medieval world, this practice was a refined art form, a fusion of culinary innovation and cultural symbolism that elevated the banquet to a theatrical and spiritual event. It demonstrated how food could transcend mere nourishment to become a powerful medium for storytelling, identity, and communal experience. The feast that ended with edible sculptures remains a vivid testament to human creativity and the enduring desire to transform everyday experiences into moments of transcendence. It invites us to reconsider the role of food in culture and history, not just as sustenance, but as art, ritual, and expression. As we imagine the clinking of goblets, the rustle of silk, and the awestruck faces of guests witnessing these sugar and bone masterpieces, we glimpse a world where the boundaries between consumption and creation, life and art, were deliciously blurred. To partake in these sculptures was to taste history itself.